Open mi kantoish, ka'awe Irene Kearns. I'm a citizen of the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria and the program manager for the National Museum of the American Indians Education Initiative, Native Knowledge 360. I have long brown hair, I'm wearing a black shirt, and I have a clamshell necklace, which was a gift given to me by my brother. I'm joining you from the Snoqualmie lands, which are outside of Seattle, Washington. And welcome to day 2 of our 2024 summer webinar on the impact of the gold rush on the Native Americans of California. If you haven't already, please take the time to complete the pre-survey. The link is in the chat. And as a reminder, you need to complete the pre and post survey to receive your certificate of participation. Today, we will provide a professional development experience about our lesson entitled The Impact of the Gold Rush on Native Americans of California. And I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement before we begin. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. This is a general land acknowledgement since we are a national museum, so we encourage you to learn the tribal histories of the lands you live on, which is the beginning of what a land acknowledgement is. Land acknowledgements are used to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the lands on which we now live and work, and are a first step in creating collaborative, accountable, continuous, and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations and communities. I'd like to take this time to give a special thanks to the teachers, scholars, and Indigenous community members that have so generously helped us to create this resource. I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Ms. Taylor Pennywell is a citizen of the Berry Creek Rancheria of Time Maidu Indians. She is the executive director of the Redbud Resource Group. Redbud helps organizations, institutions, and employers become valued partners with Native peoples and their communities. They use public health and education research to empower change for communities experiencing chronic disparities. Please note that Ms. Pennywell's comments are pre-recorded so that she can be available to answer your content-specific questions in the live Q&A feature.
My name is Taylor Pennywell, and I'm your facilitator for today. I am Time Maidu, and I'm a tribal member of Berry Creek Rancheria, Band of Maidu Indians of California. We are a federally recognized tribe located in what is now known as Butte County, California, but it is also the motherlode of the California Gold Rush and the California Indian genocide, which we are going to explore today. And so what that means is my tribe has been and is continually impacted by the legacy of these events. I'm also the executive director of Redbud Resource Group. We're a California Native-led nonprofit based in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we work to elevate the visibility of Native American people in education, in conservation, and in public health spaces. I'm really thankful that NMAI invited me to facilitate this conversation today, because it's really, really important that Native people are given the opportunity to tell our own stories. It's also important that we combat the stereotype that we no longer exist. And my presence today in this room is just proof of survival and the resilience of California's Native people to make it through some very, very difficult times. So thank you, NMAI, for having me here today. Today, I am wearing a black shirt and a yellow sweater, and I have on me a California pine nut necklace that is really special to me. It was created for me by one of my friends and mentors, and it's kind of a symbol of my culture and where I come from and my connection to the land here in California. So let's quickly review the agenda for the next 90 minutes. In a moment, I'm going to go back to the website and we're going to learn a bit about the lesson that we are going to work through today. We're going to look at the essential understandings of the lesson, and then I'm going to give you some recommendations for preparing yourself as teachers to teach and implement this lesson in your classrooms. We're then going to dive into the actual materials of this lesson by looking at some of the introductory materials to the Gold Rush and Colonialism, California that are provided to you by NMAI. We will then look at the source analysis and do some practice. And then we'll look at some extension options and ways that you can build upon the learning of the source analysis to further your students' understanding of this time period and its relevance to today. And then we will end with some session feedback. So now I am back on the home page of the lesson, The Impact of the Gold Rush on Native Americans of California, a source investigation. Again, you can see the 4 Native American survivors of the California Indian genocide here. And now I'm going to scroll down just a little bit, and you can see in the center of the page that there is a paragraph summary of the source investigation lesson. I'm going to go ahead and read it so that we kind of understand the big picture of the lesson. So it says, this inquiry lesson provides primary sources, maps, images, and background history to offer teachers and students insight into a little known but vitally important aspect of one of the most iconic events in American history, the California Gold Rush. Students will analyze sources to answer the question, do American actions against California Native Americans during the Gold Rush meet the United Nations definition of genocide? If you scroll down, you'll see that there are 3 buttons, and I'm going to click the button on the left. It says lesson information, and this is going to provide some of the basic info about the audience of this lesson. So this lesson is designed for grades 8 through 12. I don't recommend you teach it to students younger than 8th grade just because the content is a little emotionally mature, but it is really important that any teacher that teaches American history, teaches California history, that you're familiar with the content in this lesson so that you can kind of backwards plan how to prepare your students to be ready to tackle a difficult topic like California Indian genocide. Also on this page, there is a list of some of the tribal nations that are included in this lesson, the subjects, some keywords, and the region that we focus on, which is California and the West Coast in North America. At the top of this page, you can see a button with the lesson plan and the About This resource. I'm going to open up the About This resource PDF now. So right now we are looking at a PDF titled About This resource, and it provides even more information about the lesson plan. I highly recommend that you read through this thoroughly as you prepare to teach the lesson. So again, it has the grade levels, the subjects, lesson summary, but it also includes a rationale for teaching the lesson. And I think that as teachers, it's really, really important that when you're going to take on a topic like this, that you know why you are teaching it. And so NMAI has provided for you 7 or so reasons that you should teach this lesson in your class. Become familiar with these. So if you have questions from administrators or teachers or from students, that you can justify your decision to include this in your curriculum. Scrolling down to the next page, there are some recommendations about lesson pacing. This lesson does take about 2 55-minute class periods to teach, and then more if you want to include extension options. And then at the very bottom, there are some recommendations for resources that you can look at to prepare yourself to tackle a difficult conversation around the California Indian genocide. I am going to click on the link to the Let's Talk resource. And Let's Talk is a resource created by Learning for Justice, and it is a guide for facilitating critical conversations with students. It has really great recommendations about how to frame conversations for students, how to encourage them to use academic language, how to set up norms in your classroom, how to build a culture of trust so that your students feel safe being vulnerable, tackling difficult conversations that might make them a little bit uncomfortable. So please check this out as you prepare to teach this lesson. I'm now back at the home page, and I'm going to click on this button that says Academic Standards. You can see NMAI has collected academic standards for 3 different frameworks that you can look at as well when preparing to teach the lesson. Go back to the home page. I'm now going to click on the 3rd button, which is Essential Understandings. NMAI has created a really effective framework for including Native studies into your classroom, and it's essentially guidelines for how to discuss Native American issues, communities, and cultures in a way that is really well-rounded and diverse. And so they've identified 2 essential understandings that to be paired with this lesson. The first one is American Indian cultures, and it states, culture is a result of human socialization. People acquire knowledge and values by interacting with other people through common language, place, and community. In the Americas, there is a vast cultural diversity among more than 2,000 tribal groups. Tribes have unique cultures and ways of life that span history from time immemorial to the present day. So essentially identifying that there are a lot of Native American tribes in the United States and that we have always been here and that we are very, very culturally diverse. And you're going to see when we dive into some of the lesson materials just how diverse California's Native community actually is. The second essential understanding is time, continuity, and change. And it states, Indigenous people of the Americas shaped life in the Western Hemisphere for millennia. After contact, American Indians and the events involving them greatly influenced the histories of the European colonies and the modern nations of North, Central, and South America. Today, this influence continues to play significant roles in many aspects of political, legal, cultural, environmental, and economic issues. To understand the history and cultures of the Americas requires understanding American Indian history from Indian perspectives. I love this essential understanding because it really highlights that American Indians have influenced the development of the United States in many, many different ways, and we continue to do that as a people. And so if you want to learn about American history in an authentic way, you have to learn about American Indian history, and that's exactly what we're doing today. I'm now back on my slides with 3 recommendations that I would love for you to follow when preparing to teach this lesson. The first recommendation I have is to review recommended reading resources that are under the teacher instructions button on the website. I will show those to you in a moment. The second recommendation is to review resources on American Indian stereotypes in contemporary existence to ensure that you don't accidentally perpetuate these stereotypes when you teach this lesson. And the third recommendation I have is to prepare to frame the lesson from a survival lens. And this really means grounding yourself in the modern existence of Native people so that you can remind students that although the gold rush and the California Indian genocide were difficult times for the Native population, that we actually survived, right? We managed to protect our cultures and we continue to do good work in our communities today. And so now I'm going to go back to the website and I'm going to show you where resources live so that you can do this preparation work. So I'm on the website now and I'm going to scroll down till I find the button that says teacher instructions. And I'm going to click down on the teacher instructions and I'm going to click on the PDF that says recommended resources. NMAI has created a really comprehensive list of resources that you can use to prepare yourself to feel comfortable teaching this lesson and this content. And so you can see here a list of a bunch of books that I recommend that you check out from your library and you read so that you feel confident that you know what you're talking about when tackling this lesson. There is also an interview that I recommend you watch with Professor Benjamin Madley, who wrote An American Genocide. And so if you don't have time to read his 500-page book summarizing this historical event, you can just watch the interview. And at the bottom, there are some research archives as well, which include a lot of really great visual representations of the content that we're going to explore today. My second recommendation was to familiarize yourself with stereotypes and assumptions about Native people so that you don't accidentally perpetuate those stereotypes in your teaching. My organization, Redbud Resource Group, has created a series of short informational videos that explore common stereotypes and assumptions about Native American people, and also provides a bunch of teaching recommendations for teachers as well who want to make their classrooms more comfortable and safe for Native students and families. The series is called Seeing Our Native Students, and it's a bunch of videos that are like 4 to 6 minutes long. And if you review these, it's about an hour in total. You will definitely leave more prepared to teach this lesson and more familiar with stereotypes that you want to avoid in your teaching. Another resource that I highly recommend to familiarize yourself with the modern existence of Native people is News from Native California. News from Native California is a quarterly magazine published out of Berkeley, California, but it is also a website that has blogs and digital editions of their stories. News from Native California highlights contemporary stories that are coming out of California Indian country, highlights positive work that Native people are doing, that Native artists are doing, movements that youth are participating in, et cetera. It's a really great resource to familiarize yourself with the continued existence of Native people, so that when you're teaching the California Indian genocide and the gold rush, you can return back to that point that California Native people survived that time period, and we continue to exist and thrive in our communities. The last resource that I recommend for familiarizing yourself with the modern existence of Native people is Indian Country Today. Indian Country Today is a digital newspaper that, again, covers modern stories coming out of Indian country. And Indian Country Today is more national in scope. So this is really great for teachers who might be tackling this content but don't teach in the state of California itself, and you want to kind of like localize the modern existence of Native people. This is a really good resource for you as well. You're now looking at a slide titled Why This Topic Matters Now. And I've compiled 4 reasons why I think it is really, really important that teachers include this lesson and this topic in their classrooms. The first is that California as a state simply would not exist in the way that it does today if it were not for the attempted eradication and forced removal of its indigenous people from their indigenous homelands. You're going to learn about a law today. It was California's first law ever passed by the government. And the purpose of this law was to eliminate completely California's Native population so that the state could take over and build its economy, et cetera. So in order to understand how California became the economic and political powerhouse that it is today, it's really important that we go back to the origin of how the state came to be. The second reason it is important to teach this topic today is that there is a clear relationship between genocide and ecocide, not just in California, but globally. When indigenous people, the original stewards of the land, are removed from their land, it makes space for things like extractive industry to thrive. Behaviors that we now know are linked to climate change, that are linked to ecological disaster. So in California, we have a wide array of problems that we're trying to find solutions for when it comes to our environment, things like floods, things like biodiversity loss, and massive wildfires. In order to understand why we have those problems, it's essential to look at what happens when indigenous people are removed from the land. And the other point here is that learning about the traditional ways that indigenous people have cared for the land can actually point us towards solutions towards some of the ecological challenges that we are experiencing in the state. To the right, you can see a photograph that I included here of my tribal territory in Berry Creek, California. And as far as you can see is mountains with burned down forests, with charred trees. This is because since the removal of the Native people in this area, we haven't had the ability to care for our forests in our traditional way. And so now we are seeing an increase in massive wildfires that are putting people and animals and waterways in extreme danger. Another reason why it's important to teach this topic today is that the California Indian genocide is actually a precursor to many of the 20th century global genocides and human rights violations that are often taught in schools, like the Holocaust. In fact, in the case of the Holocaust, the California Indian genocide was cited as an influence for the events that took place. And so in order to understand patterns in global genocides and human rights violations, we can actually look to what the California government did to its indigenous population. The last reason why teaching this topic matters now is that California is the first state in the United States to formally acknowledge and apologize for the California Indian genocide. And in its apology, it has ushered in a movement of truth and healing between the government and the indigenous people of California. And so if we want to think about how to heal and move forward from this atrocity and other similar atrocities across the United States, we can look to California as a model. In a moment, we are going to look at the introductory materials to the lesson that have been prepared for you by NMAI. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the prior knowledge of this time period that your students might bring with them into the classroom. And I have this question here that I would like you all to consider. What prior knowledge of the gold rush or of Native Americans do your students bring with them to class? When it comes to the gold rush, they might associate the gold rush with westward expansion. They might be familiar with the gold miner as a symbol, like the 49ers football team, for example. They might be familiar with the idea of people striking it rich by finding a bunch of gold, right? And when it comes to Native Americans, man, they probably are coming in with a lot of different stereotypes. They might think that Native people live in teepees. They might think that we all got killed during westward expansion or colonization. They might be familiar with images of savages or fights between cowboys and Indians, right? And so it's really important that you collect some data on what your students already think they know so that you can understand what assumptions they're bringing with them into the classroom, and so that you can build on any prior learning that they've received as well. So I am now back on the homepage of the website, and I'm going to scroll down again to the teacher instructions, where you can see there's two options for the introduction. There's just an introduction PDF, and then there's an introduction with notes. These are teacher notes so that you can guide the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and click on the one without the notes. So you're currently looking at the slide deck that NMAI has provided to you, and it says the name of the lesson, The Impact of the Gold Rush on Native Americans of California, a source investigation. And this is a really great introductory slideshow for warming your students up and getting them prepared to engage with the source investigation. The first slide has a map of the state of California, and on the map, there are little gold dots distributed throughout the state. Each of these gold dots represents an individual gold mine that was in place during the California gold rush. I recommend that you ask your students to look at this map and think about what they notice about the distribution of these gold mines, and maybe ask some questions, get curious, right, in regards to the information on the map. So if I was going to ask my students, like, what do you notice? They would probably notice that the gold mines are really concentrated in certain parts of the state. Like, I can see that around the Sierra Nevada foothills, so eastward, there are a lot of gold mines all kind of clumped together. And then there's also a lot of gold mines concentrated in the north part of the state, where the Klamath Mountains are near the Oregon border. Looking at the southern part of the state, you can see that there's gold mines kind of sprinkled throughout the Los Angeles area and into the desert eastward as well. But then when I look at the coast area, there aren't really a lot of gold mines. And so I might ask some questions about, why are there not very many gold mines on the coast? I might ask some questions about, why are they all concentrated in like the eastern part of the state and in those foothills? I might ask some questions about the waterways. So like, how were these waterways impacted by all this gold mining? I might ask some questions about the population. Where were the people living? Were they all living in the gold mines, or were they living on the coastal regions? I know I'm familiar with San Francisco and what Los Angeles and San Diego as cities. So were most of the people living there, or were they living in the gold mines? And so you can start to ask lots of questions to get your students curious about the impact of these mines. The second slide has a map of California, and on the map of California are the different language groups, the indigenous language groups that existed pre-contact in California. You can see here that there's a lot of different language groups in the state of California. So we're going to ask this question: what do you notice about this map of pre-European contact languages in California, and does anything surprise you? Students will most likely be surprised at how many language groups there are across the state. They might start to think about how diverse the Native community actually is, and this might start to challenge their assumptions that all Native American cultures are the same, all the people are the same, because you can see here on this map that it's very diverse. They might have some questions about whether or not people still speak these languages. They might ask, are these people still here? And if not, where are they? So these are just some of the questions that your students might start to ask as they look at this map. This next slide poses the question: what questions arise as you see these two maps side by side? Let's go ahead and look at that. Here you can see on this slide, on the left, the map of California with the distribution of gold mines, and on the right, you can see the map of California with the distribution of pre-European contact indigenous language groups. When I look at these maps side by side, I notice some things. I notice that the gold mines are really concentrated in certain tribal areas. So if I look at the northeastern concentration of gold mines, I notice that the Maidu, Concow, Nisenan, and Miwok are going to be really, really impacted by the gold mines. I also notice in the north that like the Karuk and Shasta, and Wintu and Tolowa, those tribes seem to be really impacted by the concentration of gold mines. And so now I'm thinking more about like, what could that impact have looked like? I could start to ask questions about what was the relationship between the miners and these native groups? Did they get along? Did they not get along? I'm also thinking about those coastal regions where there aren't a lot of mines. I'm asking the question, how were these communities impacted by the California gold rush? Maybe they weren't impacted at all because there aren't any mines there, right? I'm not really sure. So that's something I can get curious about. And so looking at these maps is a really, really great way to get students to start thinking critically. And it starts to prepare them then to grapple with some of the complexities of California colonization. In the next few slides, I am going to review some of the early waves of colonization in the state of California. You can see here on this first slide, it is called Pre-European Contact. And on the right, there is a painting from 1850, and this is of the Presidio of San Francisco. Anyone who's been to San Francisco might recognize this area. Maybe it looks really different today, but right behind the hill here would be the Golden Gate Bridge. So scholars estimate that before the arrival of European colonists, present-day California was home to between 300,000 and 400,000 diverse native people. Some scholars today actually estimate that that number is closer to 1 million. Pre-contact, there were over 100 different languages spoken, and some of these languages, many of them in fact, are still practiced in our communities today, and there's a big language revitalization movement happening as well. Pre-contact, there were as many as 500 individual self-governing societies. Our tribes practiced tribal sovereignty, which means that we had complete control over our own resources, our way of governing, and we continue to practice this sovereignty today as well. This next slide is titled Spanish colonization. And the arrival of the Spanish really marks the first big wave of colonization in the state of California. So in 1769, Spain sent soldiers and priests to present-day California to build missions, to colonize the area, and to convert native people to Christianity. At these missions, disease, starvation, and abuse caused substantial decline of the native population. On the right of this slide, you can see a painting from 1815 of some California native people doing one of their traditional dances at the San Francisco Mission, which is now Mission Dolores in San Francisco. It's important to note when talking about the mission system in California, that California native people were actively resisting the missions the entire time. So there are case studies of people burning down the missions and also people practicing their indigenous cultures and spiritual lifeways in private to ensure that their cultures lived on beyond the mission system. So we always want to go back to that resistance and survival. And you will be able to learn more about these stories of resistance in NMAI's next lesson series, which is going to be focused on the California missions. On this next slide, we look at Mexican colonization, which is the next wave of colonization in California. So in 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain and claimed all of California its territory. Now, the Mexican government gave Native Americans Mexican citizenship, and yet under Mexican rule, California's native population declined further from disease, harsh forced labor practices, and violence. You can see in this map to the right on the slide from 1834, just how large Mexico's territory had become during this time. This next slide is called the discovery of gold because the next wave of colonization, called the American era, is really ushered in with the discovery of gold in California. So present-day California came under U.S. control in 1848, and it officially became a state in 1850. So James Marshall and a group of Nisenan Native Americans discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848. Sutter's Mill is located in Sacramento, California, the capital of California. Thousands of people from all over the world headed for California with dreams of striking it rich. And I have a couple of stats for you to help you understand what was happening with the non-native population during this time. So in 1848, right when gold was discovered, the non-native population in California was about 15,000 people, which is really not a lot of people when you think about how big California is. But by 1850, in 2 years, that non-native California population jumped to 165,000. So that is a really, really big population spike, right? Which put a lot of pressure on the state to create an economy and to create an infrastructure to support this growing settler population. On the right, you can see a photograph. This is a really amazing early photograph from 1850 of a Nisenan man with arrows. So this would be a man who was from that tribal community that was involved with James Marshall in the early discovery of gold. On this next slide, we look at what happened to the size of the native population during this time period with the early discovery of gold. So between 1846, right before the discovery of gold, and 1870, towards the tail end of the gold rush spike, California's Native American population declined from around 150 to 300,000 people down to just 30,000 people. So this would be a good time to ask your students, what do you think caused this massive decline? Why did this population drop so much? Most likely, your students are going to assume that the population drop came from disease, because this is a part of the assumptions that we have about Native people, that we were just weak biologically, and so we all died from disease when we came into contact with settlers. Let them answer that in that way, if that's what they believe. And then when they jump into the rest of this lesson, you're going to see that that assumption is going to be challenged pretty significantly. To the right on this slide, we can see two photographs from 1874 of two young Nisenan children. A brother on the left, and he's in his traditional regalia. He has a headpiece on, a flicker headpiece, and then his sister on the right as well. On this next slide, NMAI has created a visual representation of the Native American population decline between the years of 1848 and 1860. So you can see here that there's a graph with a bunch of little people that and each person symbolizes 10,000 Native American people. And so you can see that there is a massive decline in the population between 1848 and 1860. And so this graph is useful if you have any students who process things in a more visual way. And so now that your students have explored some slides detailing the early colonial periods in California, we can come to this slide that has the central question of today's lesson. Was this genocide? Remember, the big question is, do American actions against California Native Americans during the gold rush meet the United Nations definition of genocide? It's important to note here that NMAI chose to design this lesson around the United Nations definition of genocide, because this definition is the most globally accepted legal definition of genocide, and it is the definition of genocide that can be used to hold people and governments and leaders legally accountable for enacting genocide against people. And so this adds a little bit more rigor and legitimacy to the lesson, to the activity. On this next slide, I've broken down the United Nations definition of genocide into two parts. In order for an event to be legally deemed a genocide, there has to be two elements firmly in place. The first is a mental element. There needs to be a clear intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So there needs to be a clear stated intent, often by the government, that there is the goal of eradicating an entire group of people that have some kind of shared identity. If that is in place, then there also needs to be a clear physical element present as well. That physical element can include any of those 5 acts that I read before, and I'll read them again now. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, you don't need all of these physical elements to be present in order for something to be a genocide. You literally just have to have one paired with an intent to destroy. So there could be one thing present, there can be all 5 present, there can be 2 present. There just needs to be a clear connection between that mental element, that intent, and then the physical action as well. And I'll tell you, we're going to dig into the source investigation in a moment, but when it comes to the case of California, all of these are present very clearly. All right, so now I'm back on the homepage of the website, and I am going to scroll down to the source investigation button, because we are now ready to dig into the meat of this lesson, which is really the primary source investigator. So I'm going to click on one thing before I open that, and that is the graphic organizer. So you'll see here that NMAI has created 2 different versions of their graphic organizer for student. There's graphic organizer A and there's a graphic organizer B, and they are scaffolded in slightly different ways. And so take a look at those and then decide the one that you think is best for your students, or you might recommend different sourced organizers depending on your students, and kind of mix it up. I'm going to click on A for the purposes of today, and I have it open here. So you can see on graphic organizer A that the definition of genocide is right here for students to refer to as they look at their primary sources. And you can see the central question as well. Do American actions against Native Americans during the gold rush meet the United Nations definition of genocide? The first thing that students will do before they look at any sources is they're going to come up with a hypothesis or a thesis statement to answer this question. They're just going to take an educated guess based off their prior knowledge and what they gathered from the introductory slideshow. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that here before I jump into the sources. So I'm going to guess Americans committed genocide against California natives by, I'm just going to say killing members of the group. Okay. Now, as I gather evidence for this question, as I go through the actual sources, I'm going to have the opportunity to finesse my hypothesis or my thesis statement and even change it if I want to later on. This is just to get students to use their prior knowledge to make an educated guess. I'm going to go through the rest of the graphic organizer so you can see what it looks like. So now that I have my original hypothesis, I'm going to go to the next couple slides, and you can see on each slide that there is a table, and the table has rows. There's a row for each of the 11 sources that are provided in the source investigation page. And then there are columns. There's a column with the source information as the title and the date of the source. The middle column asks the question, does the source provide evidence of genocide? And if so, what criteria of the UN definition of genocide does it meet and why? And then the column on the very right has a space for hypothesis revision. Do American actions against California Native Americans during the gold rush meet the UN definition of genocide? Note here any changes you'd like to make to your original hypothesis. So you could see that maybe the evidence that they gather in the different sources doesn't match their original hypothesis. They would then go ahead and update their hypothesis to match their evidence in each row as they move through this. Now, what's really great about this is by the time students go through the sources, they basically have everything they need to write an essay. They'll be able to pick out the points that they think are the strongest and compile it into some kind of argumentative assessment paper. And so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down the rest of these slides to the last slide, slide 6, and you can see that there are directions for a summative assessment. And so the directions here are construct an argument, it could be a detailed outline or an essay that uses the evidence from the graphic organizer to answer that central question. Do American actions against California Native Americans during the gold rush meet the UN definition of genocide? Use your final hypothesis as your thesis statement or your main idea. So this is the graphic organizer that we are going to use today. And I recommend that you go ahead and open up this graphic organizer actually, and you can kind of fill in your notes and your observations along with me. So I am back on the website now, and I'm still looking at the section of the website that has the student instructions and the teacher instructions. And right above that, you can see a little box that says Source Explorer. And there's a button that says Explore Sources to investigate further. I'm going to open this up now. So we are now looking at the page titled Source Explorer. And on this page, you can see that there are different boxes with photographs and titles for 11 different sources. Admittedly, 11 sources is a lot of sources to make all of your students analyze. And so I have a couple recommendations for how you might pace this. You could choose to jigsaw these sources. So you can have students be responsible for a couple of the sources and then pair up with other students and share, or you can have certain groups responsible for tackling some of the sources and share with other groups. You might choose to assign some of these for homework, or you might just have students pick 4 or 5, right? Depending on how much time you actually have to dedicate to this work or to the level of your students. And so make sure that you adjust this to the needs of your classroom. Today, we're going to look at 2 sources very, very quickly. I wish we had a bunch of time to do this, but we're going to just pick 2 for the day. So I'm going to click on source C. And I'm choosing this source because this is a primary source from the governor of California during this time. His name was Peter Burnett. And this is actually a quote from his State of the State address that occurred on January 6th, 1851. And so you'll see on this source, NMAI has created kind of like this nice page that allows students to interact with the source in a variety of different ways. And so there is the actual quote from the State of the State address that we're going to read together. And below it, there to the right, there is the actual image of the transcript of like the actual document that you can click on so that your students can see the real thing. And then below it, there's an opportunity for students to learn more about the governor, about Peter Burnett. So they can click on his photograph that's here, and they can learn a little bit about what he was doing during this time for the state of California. And then below the quote from the State of the State address are some source analysis questions that can help your students kind of comprehend the material and get them ready to go back and fill out their graphic organizer. Before I read the source, I want to remind you all that before you start the source investigation, that you remind students of the expectations that exist in your classroom. So how do we engage in difficult conversations? How do we practice our classroom norms? How do we work through emotionally challenging topics? Make sure that they have those strategies ready at hand before they dig into these sources. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and read the first source, which again is California Governor Peter Burnett's State of the State address from January 6th, 1851. It states, "The white man to whom time is money and who labors hard all day to create the comforts of life cannot sit up all night to watch his property. And after being robbed a few times, he becomes desperate and resolves upon a war of extermination. That a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert." All right, we're not going to walk through all of these source analysis questions because I want to get to the graphic organizer, but I'll go ahead and read them for you. So the first source analysis question is, what does Governor Burnett mean by a war of extermination? What do you think he means by that? The second question is, why do you think he says the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert? Think about the context of these words. Why is it significant that the governor of California says this in the state address? And the third question is, Governor Burnett refers to a war waged between the races. Why do you think he refers to this conflict in California as a race war instead of a war between nations over territory? So your students can go ahead and have that conversation in their small group. And then when they feel like they really understand this source well, they can go back to their note taker and they can fill in their note taker. So let's go ahead and do this. Right now, you are looking at the graphic organizer for source C. I went ahead and wrote in some sentences and collected some pieces of evidence from the text that I think are relevant to making the argument that California committed genocide based on the UN's definition of genocide. So in the middle column, I went ahead and wrote in a quote from Governor Burnett's State of the State address. And I put the quote, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected." So here it's really clear to me that the goal of the California government was to completely eradicate, to exterminate the native population. And on the right, where I updated my hypothesis, I wrote, the California government committed genocide against Native peoples. It had a clear stated intent to destroy in whole the Native American population in the state. And I think that the quote that I chose there really emphasizes that. So this is one example of how your students might fill in this graphic organizer. I want to take a moment to read through one more source. You are now looking at source K, and source K is actually a Native American survivors account. It is super, super important that survivors accounts are included in this story of the gold rush and the California Indian genocide. Again, because it bucks that assumption that we no longer exist. It also reminds students that the genocide was a failed attempt to eradicate the Native population. It did not work. And so this survivor's account is of Lucy Young. Lucy Young is a Wailaki woman, and she lived on Round Valley Indian Reservation. And Round Valley Indian Reservation is a reservation that still exists in Mendocino County in California. And the account is called Out of the Past, A True Indian Story. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. Preface to Lucy's story in Out of the Past. Lucy Young, a Wailaki Indian from the vicinity of Alder Point and now living on Round Valley Reservation in Mendocino County, wishing to present to the world the Indian side of the story, in 1939 dictated the following recollections of her childhood. The major part of the narrative, as far as we can judge, took place in the summer of 1862. No attempt has been made to dress up the story. The words are Lucy's own. Lucy's account. I go to the house. Everybody crying. Mother tell me, all our men killed now. She say white men there, others from Round Valley, Humboldt County too. Kill our old uncle, Chief Lassick, and all our men. Stood up about 40 Indian in a row with a rope around neck. What's this for? Chief Lassick asked them. To hang you, dirty dogs, white men tell it. Hanging, that's dog's death, Chief Lassick say. We done nothing, be hung for. Must we die? Shoot us. So they shoot all our men, then build fire with wood and brush. Indian men been cut for days. Never know their own funeral fire they fix. Build big fire, burn all them bodies. So you can hear from that story that Lucy is not a native English speaker, right? So just remind your students of that. All right, so before we go into the source analysis questions, I want to remind you that students can expand here using this plus button, and they can look at the actual book that the text is being pulled from. You can see below as well, if you scroll down to the Learn More section, there is a photograph of Lucy Young, and there is also a map of the state of California, and it zooms in on the place where this event took place. So the students can really start to place this geographically. The source analysis questions here are what do we know about the people who killed the men in Lucy Young's community, and what happens to a community when all men are killed? Really thinking about that impact. I think this is a good time to remind everybody that yes, talking about genocide is emotionally difficult and it can be a little bit triggering. And so really make sure that you build a community of trust within your classroom. Make sure that students have access to materials and practices for taking care of themselves emotionally as well. Always remind your students that yes, this history is terrible. It is terrible that this happened to Lucy and her family, and Lucy survived. And she survived to be able to tell the story. She has a family of her own that's alive today. Her community still exists, which is a testament to the strength and the resilience of this community during this difficult time. I've now returned to my note taker, and I am on slide 5 of the note taker where source K is located. And I have filled in a couple notes on Lucy's survival account. So in the column where we're supposed to collect evidence, I collected 2 different quotes from her account. The first one is, "She say white men there, others come from Round Valley, Humboldt County too, kill our old uncle, Chief Lassick, and all our men. So they shoot all our men." And I really picked up on the all our men part, that they didn't spare anybody. They killed everyone. And so that then influences my updated hypothesis, which I've written on the right column. I wrote, "The California government committed genocide against Native peoples by killing entire groups of men from specific tribal groups." So that's how I updated my hypothesis. Just a reminder, maybe when you're teaching this, you do a couple with the students to model the kinds of thinking and, the skill of referring back to the UN definition of genocide to update your claim or your hypothesis. And once you've done a couple models for students, you can release them to do the work on their own, whether that's individually, whether it's in groups, whether they're going to jigsaw it, take some home for homework, etc. I'm going to bring us back to the final slide of the graphic organizer, and that is the slide with the summative assessment. Once your students have collected all of their evidence and they've finessed their points and their note taker, you can have them combine all of their best arguments into an essay or into an outline, really tackling that question: do American actions against California Native Americans during the gold rush meet the UN definition of genocide? If you don't want to do an essay, you could do a Socratic seminar or a presentation. There's lots of other ways that you could form this assessment as well. And on that note, I'm actually going to take us back to the lesson plan on the website so that we could look at some of the other recommendations that NMAI has provided for wrapping up this lesson. All right, I am now back on the home page of the website, and I'm going to click on the menu button on the top left, and I'm going to open up the lesson plan. Scroll down to the assessment and lesson conclusion. So NMAI has collected a bunch of different ways that you can wrap up this lesson. One is by looking at a video clip of Governor Newsom of California. And this clip specifically shows his apology to California's Native tribes from 2019. And then NMAI has also provided a couple statements from tribal leaders across the state in response to Governor Newsom's apology. And it shows the range of responses from the community. And so students can kind of talk about what's the impact of an apology? Does it really do anything to bring healing to the community? Can the state do more, et cetera? And in a moment, we're going to look at that. NMAI has also provided lots of great prompts for having class conversations, like what does justice look like today for California Native people impacted by the gold rush? What does justice look like if the perpetrators and victims lived a long time ago, right? This is not modern history. It's from 100 years back. And they also have some recommendations for exit tickets as well. And then there's recommended extensions that I am going to go into in a moment. But first, I want to look at Governor Newsom's apology. So here we have a clip. It's about a minute and 30 seconds, so it's nice and short, and it shows some of the parts of Governor Newsom's apology in 2019. We're going to go ahead and watch it now. And as you watch it, think to yourself, what is the impact of an apology like this? And do we feel that action needs to be paired with this apology? And if so, what could those actions look like? What could they be?
The acknowledgement from the governor are a lot of things that our people have known, the atrocities that have happened to us, but now to finally have it recognized by the state of California means a lot.
It's humbling for me, having believed I was educated, to have been so ignorant of our past, to have been so unaware of how ashamed I should be as a Californian, fifth generation, about how so many of your ancestors were treated. Coordination, collaboration, vigilantes, militiamen, federal soldiers working in concert. It's called a genocide. That's what it was, a genocide. And so I'm here to say the following. I'm sorry on behalf of the state of California.
It's a long time coming. You know, we've waited for generations for this apology to come. To see a governor of the state of California, an individual who represents all of the citizens within the state, come and humble himself before the tribes and issue a very heartfelt apology. It means a lot.
Now that we've watched that clip of Governor Gavin Newsom's apology to California tribes from 2019, I want to look at some of the quotes that NMAI has provided to you on the lesson plan from tribal leaders in response to the apology. So this first statement is from California State Assemblyman James Ramos of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. And he stated, "This is a history of genocide and oppression that so many Native American tribes share. Under attack, families separated, culture stolen or destroyed, displaced from land." So really acknowledging that this is a shared history and a shared story that tribes can come together to discuss, right, and to really grapple with and process. The second statement is from Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria Tribal Chairman Greg Saris, and he stated, "We'd like to dedicate this important moment to further ensure the life of California Indian people's history and culture. We need to remember the shared history of our shared past and learn from its lessons and find a path to a healthy, sustainable future for all." All right, here I have another statement from Kristen Calderon. She is Kumeyaay from the San Pascual Band of Mission Indians and an enrolled member of the non-federally recognized Juaneño Band of Mission Indians, a Hashamen nation. His apology is just words. Actions mean much more to us. The government has shown time and again that their words cannot be trusted. Action, not words. So you can see from these three responses to the governor's apology that there's a wide range in reactions, and there really is an emphasis on action. What is going to come next now that there is an apology? What kind of action is going to be taken to bring actual truth and healing to the Native community? Another way to extend your students' learning around this topic is to have them make connections to contemporary events that are happening in California Indian country so that they understand the relevance of learning about the gold rush and the California Indian genocide. And so I'm back on the homepage of the website now, and if I scroll down to the button that says student instructions, I'm going to click down, and I'm going to click on the framework for taking informed action. The framework for taking informed action is a structure created by NMAI to help students see relationships between historical events and modern events. And so you can see here that there is an opportunity for students to tackle an issue that exists and related to something they're learning about in class, and to think about their perspective on the issue, opposing perspectives, and kind of finding a middle ground in those perspectives. Without going into too much detail, there's an opportunity for students to look at an issue or a topic and to do some independent research. a Venn diagram for comparing a contemporary issue with a historical example, and also a section for taking all of their research and information that they've gathered and planning some kind of action in their community that is going to bring attention or resources to addressing the issue that they are exploring. There's also an opportunity for them to identify barriers to justice or healing or improvement around the issue that they're exploring as well, which I think is a really great way to get students to think about being problem solvers. As I mentioned in the beginning of this professional development, it is really important to remind students throughout this lesson that Native American people continue to exist in our communities despite all of the challenges that we've experienced in our history with the American government. Allowing students to do research on contemporary movements within Indian country is a great way to remind students that we are attempting to move on beyond the impacts of the gold rush and the California Indian genocide. But it's also a good reminder for students that we are still grappling with the impacts of this genocide. And so I've compiled some of the contemporary issues and movements that are happening in Indian country that might give you some ideas or directions in which to guide your students when they do their research. So on the left here on this slide, I've come up with a list. So there is the missing and murdered Indigenous women and Indigenous people epidemic that is very pervasive around the country. Native women are 10 times more likely to be murdered than any comparable group in the United States. This is something that is directly related to the violence against Native people that started during colonization. We also have continued challenges with federal recognition of tribes and tribal membership inequities. So having your students become familiar with the recognition status issue in the state, in the country might be really interesting. We also have the ecocide of the state and the destruction of the Indigenous environment. We have public health inequities. We also have cultural hibernation and cultural erasure, like the fact that most Americans don't know that Native Americans still exist. They don't know anything about tribal relations or politics in Indian country. Their textbooks are missing stories in the presence of Native people from the Native perspective. So really tackling like, why does that erasure exist is something that there are many, many, many resources on, and you could take it in a lot of different directions. You could take it by looking at sports mascots. You could look at textbooks. You could look at the erasure in politics, right? Really like whatever your students are interested, they will be able to find information on cultural erasure of Native people. On the right, I have listed some of the responses that are coming from Indian country to try to address the ongoing challenges that exist in the community. So in the state of California, the state government recently created something called the Feather Alert. And this is like an Amber Alert system, but specifically for tribal communities and specifically geared towards Indigenous people that go missing from their communities. We now have an entire system that's just designed to try to mitigate the missing and murdered Indigenous women's and people epidemic. We also have a accelerated rate of land return or land back of Indigenous land back to tribal communities. And so this is all about restoring ownership of land back to tribes. And this is really as a way to mitigate climate change and also a way to mitigate public health issues that happen in the Native community, because we don't have access to our traditional ways of life if we don't have access to our land. We also have tribal co-management of parks and of different landscapes and tribal co-stewardship as well. And then we also have a really thriving cultural revitalization movement. So people are learning their languages again, they're reconnecting with their traditional medicine life ways, their traditional spiritual life ways, making art, making baskets. And so there's plenty of opportunities for your students to learn about Native artists and cultural teachers who are working to revitalize our ways of life. I'm now back on the website and I'm scrolling down to the very bottom because I want to show you one example of a piece of art that your students could use when doing their research and thinking about the revitalization and the increasing presence of Native culture And so I'm going to click on this button. This is artist perspective. And here you can see a painting by Native artist Harry Fonseca, and he is Nisenan Maidu. So remember, Nisenan Maidu was a tribal community that's in the motherlode of the California gold rush and the California Indian genocide. This community is heavily, heavily impacted and has been continually impacted by many of the contemporary issues in Indian country as well. And so you can see a picture of the artist, and there's a picture of a piece that he made, and it is called The Discovery of Gold in California. You can see that there are some themes of genocide and of gold in this painting. And then there's a little biography and description of the piece with a quote from the artist themselves. And so your students can look at this and maybe even use this as a jumping off point to research more contemporary Native artists in their community and start thinking about how the themes of the gold rush, of ecocide, and of genocide are integrated into many of these art pieces. So now that we have explored NMAI's website, we have done the introductory slides reviewing colonialism in California. We learned about the UN definitions of genocide. We practiced some of the source analysis activities that NMAI provided to us, and we looked at a number of extension and conclusion options. I would like everyone to take a moment to consider how you will integrate the ideas and activities in this lesson into your curriculum. Do you think that you have space to teach this entire lesson? Are there pieces of it that you think that you can integrate into pre-existing units, perhaps units on westward expansion that you have already created in your classroom? Take a moment to think about that. Thank you, everybody, for taking a moment to consider how you will integrate the ideas and activities of this lesson into your classroom. We are now going to move into a period of workshop feedback. And so NMAI should be delivering you all a feedback form. We'd love to hear your reactions to the lesson, questions you still have, ways that we might further support you. Also, any feedback on my delivery of the professional development as well. Everything is useful, and we appreciate the time that you provided for us today to explore these resources. All right, this last slide, we have some of the image credits for the images that you saw in the lesson today.
Thank you so much for participating in our summer webinar. We are grateful that you joined us. Please complete our post survey that we are dropping in the chat. As a reminder, you need to complete the pre and post survey to receive your certificate of participation. Lastly, we encourage you to sign up for our e-blast to get the latest on lesson releases and professional development opportunities from Native Knowledge 360. Kamalish, thank you for coming.